My name is Steve Fleming. I'm a Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience and run a lab studying consciousness and metacognition. Welcome to my exp. Consciousness is usually defined as the subjective feeling of what it is like to have an experience. Now that's somewhat circular, but we can define consciousness with reference to its absence. So there are many mental processes which we think of as being entirely unconscious. I'm not conscious of the brain processes that are enabling me to see things in 3 dimensions. I'm not conscious of the processes that contract certain muscles as I move my hands. And so there is a subset of our mental lives which we are conscious of, and we can communicate that to others. We can experience it in a way that allows us to remember it, to do things with it, to manipulate it, and then ultimately tell each other about it. There are lots of competing perspectives in the field that are attempting to explain the difference between conscious and unconscious states in the brain. One perspective that we're pursuing in our lab is rooted in theories of reality monitoring. So reality monitoring is the capacity of the brain to distinguish between activity that is internally generated, for instance, activity that's generated by expectations or by working memory or by imagination, and that activity that is generated by a feature of the outside world. And we think one explanation for conscious experience is that consciousness is tracking those brain states that are reliable reflections of the outside world, and it's discarding the ones that are simply internally simulated or generated or due to internal noise. So one hypothesis about the functions of conscious experience is that consciousness is tagging certain neural representations as being reliable reflections of the outside world. And this is why consciousness has what philosophers call assoteric force. It forces us to believe in the reality of the outside world. That's its job. One line of work we've been pursuing on consciousness has been examining how people are able to distinguish between reality and imagination, or aspects of their mental life that are internally generated. And the way these experiments work is that we ask people to imagine a simple stimulus on a computer screen, like a set of tilted lines. And we ask them to imagine this embedded in flickering noise on the screen. And the trick that we have in the lab is that on some trials of the experiment, we actually fade in very gradually a real stimulus, and that stimulus can either be the same as the one that they're trying to imagine, or it can be something different. And what we find is that people readily experience confusions between reality and imagination in this setup. So when we ask people to judge whether a stimulus has really been presented, if they happen to be vividly imagining that same stimulus on a particular trial, then they would be likely to say something real, they'd be more likely to say something real was out there. It's as if the signals from imagination and perception are becoming intermixed in the mind. And we find, using brain imaging, using functional MRI, that this intermixing is taking place in mid-level visual cortex, so towards the back of the brain in an area known as the fusiform gyrus. This is where intermixing seems to be happening between perception and imagination. And then we see other regions of the brain in the insular and the medial prefrontal cortex towards the front of the brain are tracking how strong those signals are, how reliable those signals are, and using that information to generate a judgment about whether something is real or imagined. So we think that these areas of the brain working together can accomplish reality monitoring. This work is consistent with the proposal that when we imagine something, we use the same resources within the brain as when we actually perceive that same thing. So if I perceive a dog sitting on the rug in front of me, and then I close my eyes and try and imagine that same dog sitting on the rug, I will activate similar neural populations in my visual cortex as when I actually perceive the scene. And this shows that the brain has a difficult problem. It needs to try and figure out whether the activation of those neural populations, say in the visual cortex, are being caused by the real world out there or are somehow internally generated. And we think that that operation that the brain is trying to engage in is key to understanding distortions in how people confuse imagination for reality, for instance, in cases like hallucinations. So one powerful perspective on the origins of hallucinations in conditions like schizophrenia is that it reflects an imbalance between how much of our perception is internally generated and how much is being driven by the outside world. If we turn up the dial on these internal processes, then we might start activating these perceptual areas of the brain in a way that is completely divorced from reality. And if in those situations we also have distortions in reality monitoring, so if people are unable to realize that those internal processes are in their imaginations, then they might think that they are as real as the outside world. And I think this perspective is a powerful one because it can allow us to understand why someone may not only experience hallucinations, but also lack insight into the fact that those are hallucinatory experiences. A distortion in metacognition or reality monitoring can lead people to not have the self-awareness that their perceptual experiences might not actually reflect the outside world. There are a variety of disorders of consciousness where people might, due to brain damage or other injury, go into a coma state or a vegetative state. And these can be cases where the sleep-wake cycle remains intact. So physiologically, people seem to wake up and go to sleep again. And yet there are no signs of any internal conscious brain processes going on. Now, a subset of those cases do seem to show some signs of conscious experience. And this has been an amazing discovery by colleagues of mine, particularly my colleague Adrian Owen, who's based in Canada. He has shown that it's possible in a small number of patients who are in a vegetative state to communicate with them by asking them to imagine particular experiences. These patients are not able to verbally communicate or issue any behavioral response. But if the patients are placed inside a brain imaging scanner, a functional MRI machine, and Adrian asks them to imagine doing certain things like playing tennis or walking around their house, then he has shown that some patients, not all of them by any stretch, but some, a small subset, can voluntarily activate circuits in their brains that are normally activated when a healthy person would imagine similar experiences. And so this is an incredible finding because it suggests that there is residual capacity for imagination and therefore, we think, for conscious experience in patients who are otherwise entirely behaviourally unresponsive. And that suggests that in a small number of cases, but obviously with huge clinical importance, there are patients in these states of unresponsiveness who are nevertheless still conscious at some level.